You think physical pain is the worst thing a mother can inflict? No. The ultimate cruelty is smiling while burning a child's most sacred memory. When my own mother threw my 7-year-old son's plaster hand into the blazing barbecue, she wanted to leave a permanent scar on his soul. But as the flames roared, a tiny electronic beep changed everything. That single sound shattered her fake high society facade and turned her extravagant party into a graveyard for her lies. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. I want to thank you sincerely for your continuous support of our channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our videos, leaving us with no budget to operate and keep our platform alive. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Elena Carlson. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life was a ledger of exhausting debts I never actually owed. I work as a dedicated risk analyst at Ethelgard Financial Solutions, a major corporate firm. It is a deeply ironic profession, considering I spent decades completely blind to the greatest, most devastating risk in my own life. That risk was my own mother, Margaret. Margaret was a woman entirely consumed by the toxic illusion of high society. We lived in Bellevue, Washington, a famously expensive suburb where your human worth was strictly measured by the square footage of your estate and the designer labels stitched into your clothes. But Margaret did not have the generational wealth required to genuinely support her endless ambitions. Instead, she had me. She masterfully used the sacred concepts of family duty and morality as blunt weapons, twisting them into an emotional extortion racket designed to drain every cent I earned. While I analyzed corporate data for over 60 hours a week, my older sister Vanessa lived like royalty. Vanessa was the undeniable golden child of our family. She was fiercely arrogant, chronically unemployed, and yet somehow always draped in the latest European runway fashion. Her luxurious lifestyle, ranging from her 5-star vacations in France to her daily organic spa treatments, was entirely funded by premium credit cards that had my name printed on the front. I was brainwashed from a young age to believe this was simply what a good sister did to support her sibling. The only reason I survived my childhood with any shred of sanity intact was my father. He was a quiet, gentle man, the sole beam of genuine light in a house suffocated by vanity and greed. He shielded me from Margaret's worst demands, but he passed away from a brutal, prolonged illness a few years ago. When his heart finally stopped beating, the last protective barrier between me and the women of my family totally collapsed. I was left drowning in the psychological cage he left behind, utterly defenseless. Without his presence, my role rapidly solidified into becoming an invisible bank. I was breaking my back to cover the massive mortgage on a house I did not even live in. I funded Vanessa's extravagant whims without question, and I paid the expensive caterers for Margaret's fake charity fundraising parties. Every time I dared to express my extreme exhaustion or hint at my dwindling bank account, Margaret would sigh loudly, press a manicured hand over her heart, and deliver a tearful speech. "We only have each other now. Elena," she would cry. "Your father would be devastated to see us struggling. Family must stick together." The guilt she layered on me was unbearably heavy, and I carried it obediently, draining my own savings to keep their glamorous facade alive. The suffocating manipulation reached its absolute peak during a chilling afternoon in late autumn. Vanessa had decided she desperately needed her own private mansion, claiming her current luxury apartment was simply too small for her social life. Margaret cornered me in my own living room, abruptly pushing a thick stack of legal documents across my coffee table. "It is just a standard financial guarantee." "Elena," Margaret said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and forced casualty, "Vanessa needs this house for her mental health, and your excellent credit score is the absolutely only way the bank will approve the loan. You are not paying for it. You are just co-signing to help your sister." I stared down at the paperwork. The figures printed on the pages were astronomical, easily hundreds of thousands of dollars in liability. Something dark, cold, and primal twisted deep in my stomach. The documents felt completely wrong. They were incredibly vague, lacking the standard banking headers I saw every single day at my firm. When I hesitated, analyzing the dangerous clauses, Vanessa rolled her eyes and crossed her arms in disgust. Honestly, Elena, Vanessa scoffed, glaring at me. Dad would be so incredibly disappointed to see how utterly selfish you have become. I thought we were a family. That word, family, tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. For the first time in 32 years, the thick fog of lifelong manipulation finally broke. I looked closely at the signature lines, realizing with terrifying clarity that signing this paper meant putting my entire career, my immaculate financial reputation, and my future on the line for a sister who would not even buy me a cup of coffee. It was not just a simple loan guarantee. It felt like a deliberate anchor designed to drag me to the bottom of the ocean while they sailed away on a yacht. That single piece of paper was the vital spark of suspicion that finally woke me up to the terrifying reality of the monsters I shared my blood with. I refused to sign that vague, dangerous document. That single, terrifying word of defiance was the match that burned my old life to the ground. I realized I could not stay another minute in their toxic web. I packed exactly 2 suitcases with my clothes and walked out of the apartment I had paid for but never truly owned. I left behind the expensive furniture, the designer decorations, and every physical tie I had to their fake world. I cut off all their financial access, leaving my bank accounts with zero balances after paying the final month of their bills. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media profiles, and vanished from their reality. For the very first time in my 32 years of existence, I inhaled deeply and felt clean air fill my lungs. The journey to heal my deeply shattered mind was not easy. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified of retribution. But stepping into the unknown led me to Derek. Derek is a brilliant architect, a man whose entire personality is built on steady, unbreakable foundations. He is profoundly calm, endlessly warm, and possessed a level of patience I never knew existed in human beings. Whenever I woke up soaked in sweat, shivering from nightmares about Margaret dragging me to court, or Vanessa destroying my career, Derek would simply wrap his strong arms around me. He would softly say, "You are safe here, Elena. Nobody can hurt you anymore." Step by step, brick by brick, he helped me rebuild my completely destroyed self-esteem. He taught me that family is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a financial slaughterhouse. He showed me that true love is freely given, not forcefully extracted. Our beautiful sanctuary was made complete when we welcomed our son, Leo, into the world. Today, Leo is 7 years old. He is a remarkably gentle, obedient boy with an incredibly sensitive soul. He possesses an emotional intelligence that constantly amazes Derek and me. He is the kind of child who carefully moves a stray earthworm off the sidewalk so it will not get stepped on. He always asks how my day was, looking at me with big, sincere eyes. Just weeks before my father finally lost his long battle with his terrible illness, I managed to orchestrate one secret visit. I brought my tiny newborn Leo to his sterile hospital room, hiding completely from Margaret and Vanessa. During that quiet afternoon, a wonderfully compassionate nurse helped us create something truly magical. We mixed a bowl of alginate and cast a perfect plaster mold of my father's frail, wrinkled hand, wrapping tightly and protectively around my baby boy's tiny fingers. My father passed away exactly 5 days later. That solid white sculpture became Leo's absolute most prized possession. It is not just an object sitting on a dusty shelf. It is a sacred relic. It is his physical connection to a man he was too young to remember, but loves with all his heart. The plaster hand sits right on his nightstand, and he gently traces the lifelike wrinkles of his grandfather's fingers whenever he feels anxious or needs comfort. For my sweet Leo, that fragile piece of art is the singular, irreplaceable symbol of the only genuine love he ever received from his maternal family. For 7 unbroken, wonderful years, I maintained a strict, impenetrable fortress around my husband and my son. I blocked absolutely every avenue of communication. I did not speak a single syllable to my mother or my sister. I relentlessly returned their manipulative letters completely unopened. Derek and I built a quiet, prosperous life entirely on our own terms, completely insulated from the toxic drama of Bellevue. However, no matter how high you build your walls, the wind will always carry the whispers of the outside world. Through mutual acquaintances in the corporate finance sector, I heard the inevitable, ugly rumors. The luxurious lifestyle Vanessa stubbornly refused to abandon had finally caught up with them. Margaret's elaborate, fake charity galas were no longer generating enough cash to cover the astronomical 25% interest rates on their maxed-out credit cards. Word on the street was that their entire financial house of cards was collapsing. They were standing on the absolute edge of total bankruptcy, drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, desperately dodging collection agencies. Whenever I heard these updates, I felt a strange, hall detachment. I reminded myself that their impending ruin was exactly the nightmare I had narrowly escaped by walking away. We were safe in our warm home, our bills were paid, our son was happy, and the demons of my past were locked away behind 7 years of silence. I deeply believed the nightmare was over for good. The silence of those 7 years was broken on a Tuesday afternoon. A thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my secure mailbox. Inside was a glossy invitation to a family barbecue and memorial service honoring the anniversary of my father passing away. Accompanying it was a frantic, tear-soaked voicemail from Margaret. "Elena, please," she sobbed through the speaker, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine regret. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I just want to meet my grandson before I get too old. We are setting up a beautiful memorial garden for your father out back. Please bring Leo, and please, bring that plaster cast of their hands. I want to place it on his memorial altar so we can finally take one complete family photograph." I played that message 4 times. My immediate instinct was to throw the expensive invitation directly into the fireplace, but Derek had just boarded a morning flight for an urgent, 3-day business trip in Denver. Without his grounding presence, my emotional armor cracked just a fraction. The thought of my father, and the idea of giving Leo a chance to formally honor the grandfather he loved so deeply, clouded my usually sharp judgment. Against every screaming alarm bell in my head, I dressed Leo in his best little shirt, carefully wrapped the heavy plaster hand in a soft blue towel, and drove towards Bellevue. The moment I stepped through the massive wrought iron gates of my childhood home, the cold realization hit me. I had walked straight into a trap. There was no quiet, respectful memorial service. The sprawling backyard was completely transformed into a loud, ostentatious networking event. A massive industrial barbecue roared in the center, flanked by hired waiters carrying trays of imported champagne and expensive caviar. A live jazz trio played in the corner. Dozens of wealthy neighbors and local business owners milled about in designer summer wear. This was not a tribute to my father. It was a desperate, flashy pitch, perfectly designed to lure naive investors and save Margaret from her mounting financial ruin. "Well, look who finally decided to crawl out of the cheap suburbs," a sharp, mocking voice sneered. Vanessa stood near the outdoor bar, heavily leaning on her smug husband. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, making sure her voice carried to the guests nearby. She immediately turned to a group of elderly couples holding champagne flutes. "Everyone, this is my little sister, Elena. She is just a boring corporate data clerk. She actually thinks she understands high finance better than we do." Her husband laughed loudly, adding cruel, dismissive remarks about my modest car parked outside. Worse than their direct insults was how they weaponized their own children. Vanessa actively nudged her 3 spoiled kids, whispering sharply into their ears and pointing at my son. Within 10 minutes, they had completely isolated Leo. When my sweet boy politely tried to show them a shiny pebble he found on the patio, they blatantly turned their backs and laughed loudly at him. Leo clutched the towel-wrapped plaster hand tighter against his small chest, his big eyes shining with unshed tears. He did not understand why his family was being so mean. My blood boiled. I needed a moment to breathe before I grabbed my son and stormed out of that cursed place forever. I slipped inside the house to find the guest restroom and splash some cold water on my face. But as I walked down the dim, familiar hallway, I heard hushed, panicked voices coming from the home office. I froze, holding my breath and pressing my back against the cold wall. It was Margaret and Vanessa, and they were engaged in a vicious argument. "The bank is threatening to foreclose in exactly 14 days. Mother," Vanessa hissed aggressively, "if you do not get these oblivious idiots out there to write those investment checks today, we are completely ruined. I am not losing my house." "Keep your voice down," Margaret snapped back, sounding frantic and breathless. "The paperwork is already forged. I used the corporate letterheads I took from Elena years ago. Once they see her firm is supposedly backing the real estate development fund, they will sign everything over. We just need her out there looking like a supportive, wealthy partner. Do not ruin this for us by provoking her." My heart slammed against my ribs so hard, it physically hurt. It was not just a tacky fundraising party. It was a massive, highly illegal fraud scheme. They were actively using my name and the reputation of my employer to scam their rich neighbors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The red flags I had ignored were not just warnings. They were the terrifying reality of a criminal conspiracy happening right under my nose. I knew I had to get Leo out of there immediately and call the police, but as I turned to rush back to the yard, a loud commotion erupted near the roaring barbecue grill. I burst out of the dimly lit hallway, my mind racing with the horrific reality of the massive fraud I had just uncovered. I needed to find my son and leave immediately, but before I could even step off the patio, Margaret intercepted me. She materialized out of the crowd, clutching a leather binder, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. She grabbed my arm with bruising force and dragged me toward a group of 3 wealthy-looking men. "Elena, darling," she announced loudly, her voice shrill and tight. "These gentlemen are just waiting for your final signature on the corporate backing documents. Show them how much your firm supports our new community initiative." She shoved a gold pen into my hand and pushed the binder against my chest. I looked at the forged documents, then up at the expectant faces of the investors she was actively trying to rob. The audacity was utterly breathtaking. I did not whisper. I did not politely decline. I raised my voice so several people nearby could hear me perfectly clearly. "I am not signing anything, Margaret," I stated coldly, dropping the gold pen onto the stone patio. "My firm has absolutely zero involvement with this, and I will not be a part of whatever illegal scam you are running." The silence that fell over that small section of the patio was deafening. The investors awkwardly stepped back, whispering to each other. Margaret's heavily powdered face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The veins in her neck bulged. I had just publicly ruined her fraudulent lifeline, and the sheer fury in her eyes was terrifying. But she did not scream at me. Instead, her venomous gaze shifted across the yard, landing directly on the most vulnerable target available. About 30 feet away, my sweet 7-year-old boy was carefully making his way across the manicured lawn. Leo was gently holding the unwrapped plaster cast of his grandfather's hand, looking around confusedly for the memorial altar Margaret had promised him. There was no altar. There were only drunk guests and the massive, roaring industrial barbecue grill at the edge of the patio. Before I could even move, Margaret marched rapidly toward Leo. She intercepted him in a small, shadowy alcove between the towering hedges and the searing heat of the cooking station. The guests were distracted by the jazz band, but from my vantage point, I had a clear line of sight. I started running, but I was too late to stop what happened next. Margaret reached down and violently yanked the heavy plaster sculpture right out of Leo's small hands. My son gasped in shock, reaching up to get it back. Margaret leaned down, her face inches from his, and hissed something terrible into his ear. I could not hear the exact words over the noise of the party, but I saw the devastating impact. Leo's face crumbled into absolute despair. He shrank back, his little shoulders shaking, utterly crushed by whatever toxic venom she had just injected into his pure, sensitive soul. I learned later that she told him his grandfather never loved him, and that the statue was just a piece of garbage, exactly like his mother. Then, Margaret stepped out from the shadows of the hedges and moved directly in front of the massive, open barbecue grill. The bed of coals was glowing a fierce, angry orange, radiating intense waves of heat into the summer air. She held the sacred sculpture high above the flames. She locked eyes with me across the patio. A cold, triumphant, psychopathic smirk stretched across her face. She knew exactly how to inflict the maximum amount of psychological agony. She wanted to punish me for destroying her financial scam, and she was using my child's most precious memory to do it. With a vicious, deliberate flick of her wrist, Margaret threw the solid plaster hands straight into the center of the blazing inferno. Time seemed to slow down to an agonizing crawl. I watched the pure white sculpture crash onto the glowing red coals. The immense heat immediately began to scorch the material. Within seconds, a sickening crack echoed from the grill as the intense temperature split the fragile plaster in half. The perfect, lifelike rendering of my father's protective fingers gripping my newborn son's hand blackened, blistered, and broke apart, completely consumed by the flames. "Oh my goodness!" Margaret suddenly shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice dripping with incredibly fake panic. She threw her hands over her mouth, playing to the crowd that had just turned to look. "It slipped. Oh, it was an accident. My hands were just so slippery from the barbecue sauce. I am so clumsy." She wailed and gasped, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance for the horrified guests. But when she lowered her hands, she shot me another look, a look of pure, victorious malice. She had struck the deepest, most agonizing blow possible, and she thought she had gotten away with it perfectly. A sound ripped through the backyard that I will never, ever forget. It was Leo, my quiet, gentle boy, let out a guttural, earth-shattering scream of pure, unadulterated anguish. He collapsed onto the grass, sobbing so violently he could barely breathe, his tiny hands reaching uselessly toward the fire that was devouring his grandfather. The psychological trauma radiating from his small body was unbearable. A blinding, primal motherly rage exploded inside my chest. My vision actually tinted red. I did not care about the guests. I did not care about the law. I was fully prepared to grab Margaret by her designer dress and throw her into the fire alongside the ashes of my father's memory. I sprinted the last few yards. My fists clenched so tightly, my fingernails drew blood from my own palms. I dropped to my knees to grab my hysterical child before launching myself at the monster who birthed me. But right as my hands touched Leo's shaking shoulders, a very sharp, very distinct electronic noise sliced clearly through his heartbreaking sobs. Beep! It was a loud, high-pitched, synthetic sound. It came directly from the thick, durable smartwatch strapped securely to Leo's left wrist. Derek and I had bought him that specific watch for his birthday, primarily for the GPS tracking, but it had one other vital feature. We had taught Leo that if he was ever scared, bullied, or approached by a stranger, he just needed to hold down the heavy side button for 3 seconds to activate the emergency audio recording. My son, terrified by the screaming women and the hostile children at this awful party, had been clutching his wrist the entire time he was walking across the yard. He had activated the microphone long before Margaret had cornered him by the hedges. The red recording light on the digital face of the watch clicked off, signaling the file was saved. The roaring fire in the grill suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the absolute inferno of justice I was about to unleash. I looked down at the small, glowing screen of Leo's smart watch. The digital recording icon had stopped, confirming the audio file was successfully saved. Because my phone was securely linked as the parent device, the file immediately synchronized and popped up on my mobile screen. I tapped the play icon, pressing the phone's speaker closely to my ear. I fully expected to hear only the terrible, toxic words Margaret had just hissed at my son, but my brave, terrified little boy had activated the emergency recording much earlier than I realized. He had been hiding right outside the open window of the home office when the other wealthy children chased him away. The highly sensitive microphone on his wrist had picked up absolutely everything. The audio was incredibly crystal clear. It perfectly captured Margaret and Vanessa screaming at each other in the hallway. It captured Margaret explicitly, undeniably admitting she had been forging my signature and illegally using the Ethelgard financial corporate accounts to launder money and actively evade federal taxes for the past 2 years. And then, the recording captured the sickening crunch of the grass as she approached Leo, followed by her venomous voice hissing that his grandfather hated him. The blinding, fiery rage inside my chest instantly froze into a solid, unbreakable block of ice. I did not scream. I did not throw a useless punch or lose my mind. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying, utterly hollow smile that I had never felt on my own face before. I wrapped my arms tightly around my sobbing son, stood up tall, and took a deliberate step back from the glowing grill. With 2 quick, calculated taps on my screen, I sent the massive audio file directly to my secure, heavily encrypted cloud storage server. The ultimate weapon was now immortalized, far beyond their reach. The live jazz band was still playing a lively, upbeat tune on the far side of the patio. The massive central speaker system was wired right next to the outdoor bar, controlled by a simple auxiliary cable plugged into a rented tablet. I walked toward the music stand with a perfectly measured, terrifyingly calm stride. Margaret was still dramatically wiping fake tears from her eyes, loudly playing the helpless victim of a clumsy accident for the crowd. Vanessa was standing proudly next to the 3 wealthy investors I had met earlier, holding out a shiny silver pen for them to sign the fraudulent checks. I reached the sound system, pulled the thick audio cable out of the tablet, and plugged it directly into the headphone jack of my phone. I dragged the volume slider up to the absolute maximum limit. I pressed play. The lively jazz music vanished instantly. Instead, Margaret's panicked, shrill voice blasted through the massive, concert-quality speakers, echoing violently off the expensive brick walls of the mansion. "The bank is threatening to foreclose in exactly 14 days. Mother," Vanessa's recorded voice aggressively hissed across the yard. "Keep your voice down," Margaret's voice snapped back over the speakers. "The paperwork is already forged. I used the corporate letterheads I took from Elena years ago. Once they see her firm is supposedly backing the real estate development fund, they will sign everything over. We have been laundering this cash through her fake accounts for 2 years. Vanessa, if we do not get these oblivious idiots out there to write those investment checks today, we go to federal prison." The entire backyard completely froze. The clinking of expensive champagne glasses stopped instantly. The hired waiters stood completely paralyzed. Then, the audio continued playing, transitioning to the terrifying moment by the grill. Margaret's voice dripped with pure, concentrated evil as she spoke to my son. "Your grandfather never loved you, you pathetic little brat. This statue is just a piece of garbage, exactly like your mother." The horrified gasps from the dozens of elite guests sucked all the oxygen out of the summer air. The 3 wealthy investors standing next to Vanessa turned completely white. One of the older men slowly lowered the silver pen, his expression violently twisting from polite admiration into absolute, unfiltered disgust. They realized in a fraction of a second that they were not exclusive business partners. They were simply the latest targets of a massive, organized fraud ring. Vanessa dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered loudly against the stone patio, snapping the silence. Margaret stood completely frozen by the barbecue, her jaw unhinged, staring at the giant black speakers as if they were a loaded gun pointed directly at her head. Her carefully constructed high society facade had not just cracked, it had been entirely pulverized into fine dust. I smoothly pulled my phone from the audio cable, leaving the heavy, stunned silence to completely suffocate them. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I dialed my corporate financial lawyer. Yes, I need to report a massive, ongoing financial crime, I stated loudly, projecting my voice so every single person on the patio could hear my exact words. Please loop in the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I have undeniable audio proof of identity fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion spanning the last 2 years. The perpetrators are currently located at my coordinates. The absolute reality of federal prison finally snapped their frozen shock. Vanessa let out a feral, desperate shriek. She lunged across the patio, her manicured claws aiming directly for my face to destroy the phone in my hand. Margaret snapped out of her paralysis and charged at me from the grill, screaming like a trapped animal, desperate to smash the device and silence the truth. But they never even got close. The wealthy guests they had tried to rob were absolutely furious. 2 large men in expensive suits immediately stepped in front of me, shoving Vanessa back with tremendous force. Before Margaret could even cross the grass, 3 uniformed neighborhood security guards, who had been hired to monitor the front gate, rushed into the backyard. They tackled Margaret and Vanessa straight down into the dirt. Their elegant designer dresses were instantly ruined, violently smeared with wet mud and spilled alcohol. I stood perfectly still, holding my crying son tightly against my hip, watching the 2 women who had tortured me my entire life thrash and scream uselessly on the ground. It took exactly 20 minutes for the deafening wail of police sirens to completely tear through the quiet, exclusive wealth of the Bellevue neighborhood. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the manicured driveway as multiple squad cars, followed closely by unmarked black SUVs from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, swarmed the property. Heavily armed agents and economic crime detectives swiftly locked down the entire estate. Guided by the detailed testimony I provided on the spot, investigators immediately raided the home office, seizing Vanessa's laptops, encrypted hard drives, and every single forged document hidden in their expensive mahogany desks. Margaret was hauled up from the ruined lawn, her wrists locked tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. Her elegant, thousands of dollars worth designer dress was completely smeared with thick mud and spilled cocktail mixers. She thrashed against the officers, her heavily powdered face streaked with black mascara tears. She looked wildly across the patio until her desperate eyes found me. "Elena, please," she wailed loudly, her voice cracking with pathetic terror. "I am your mother. You cannot let them do this to me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, drop the charges." I stood perfectly still on the patio, holding my son securely in my arms. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I simply looked down at the woman who had tormented me for my entire existence and offered her nothing but a cold, silent stare of absolute contempt. It was the look of a stranger. That profound, empty silence finally broke her. She sobbed hysterically as the officers forced her into the back of a police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut on her reign of psychological terror forever. 3 months later, a highly publicized federal trial opened in downtown Seattle. Margaret's expensive defense attorney desperately tried to paint his client as a tragic, overwhelmed mother who had merely made a few misguided financial mistakes out of blind love for her family. He actually managed to squeeze a few sympathetic sighs from the courtroom gallery. Then, the federal prosecutor stood up and played the raw, unedited audio file from my son's smartwatch. When the jury and the presiding judge heard the sheer, unadulterated cruelty in Margaret's voice as she deliberately shattered the sacred memory of a grieving 7-year-old boy just to punish his mother, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom violently shifted. Any illusion of maternal desperation evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating wave of collective disgust. The judge actually stopped the proceedings to glare furiously down at the defense table. The final verdict was absolute and merciless. Margaret was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Vanessa, heavily implicated in the massive wire fraud and tax evasion conspiracy, received a solid sentence of 8 years behind bars. The court ordered the immediate forfeiture of their entire estate, the sprawling Bellevue mansion, the luxury vehicles, and all their frozen bank accounts were completely liquidated by the federal government to aggressively compensate the banks and the wealthy neighbors they had attempted to defraud. The story violently exploded across national news networks and American social media platforms. I never asked for the spotlight, but the shocking details of the trial turned our family into an overnight symbol of justice. Millions of people praised the decisive, unapologetic way I handled the situation. Thousands of strangers reached out to me, sharing that my actions gave them the ultimate courage to finally stand up to the deeply toxic, abusive manipulators hiding within their own families. Today, the dark, suffocating fog of my past is entirely gone. The final scene of this chaotic chapter did not take place in a courtroom, but in the bright, sun-drenched backyard of our own home. Derek and I sat on a soft picnic blanket spread across the warm grass between us. Leo was giggling happily, his hands covered in a messy, white paste. We had mixed a brand new bowl of alginate. Instead of a somber memorial, we were building a monument to our future. Leo pushed his small hand deep into the soft mold, and Derek and I firmly wrapped our hands around his, our fingers safely interlocking together, as the bright afternoon sun gently dried the new plaster. I looked at my wonderful husband and my bravely healing son. We officially closed the door on the shadows of the past, stepping forward into a beautiful, unbreakable life of complete and total freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and satisfying, please consider helping our team. With YouTube completely removing our monetization, we rely entirely on your kindness. By donating just $1, you can help us pay our dedicated staff so they can feed their families and continue bringing you the high-quality stories you love. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code right here on the screen, or by using the secure donation link provided in the description box and the pinned comment. Thank you for standing with us, and I will see you in the next story.